So today we have invited Professor Dragan Gasevic. He is a distinguished professor of learning analytics and director of research in the Department of Human-Centered Computing of the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University. He is also the director for the Center of Learning Analytics, and his research interests center around data analytics, AI, and design methods that can advance understanding of self-regulated and collaborative learning. He is also a founder and served as the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research and a recipient of the Lifetime Member Award in 2022 as the highest distinction of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, SOLA. So today we have invited him to share with us about his work and research titled Generative AI in Education, Cultivating Potential While Navigating Shadows. So Professor Gasevic, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction and also for the honor of the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here today with you all and talk a little bit about generative AI in education. Today, I'm going to try to give a relatively broad overview of some of the things in terms of what has happened so far and where we are heading in this space, what we need to pay attention to, etc. With obviously one thing in mind that I'll be also giving another talk in a couple of weeks as well that you kindly invited me. And in that one, I'm going to be specifically focusing on assessment. About a year ago, when we were in the almost kind of the peak of the hype that kind of happened is, I guess, many people who are today in the room got familiar as well. What do we mean by generative artificial intelligence? And in a nutshell, we really are trying to generate data in response to different types of prompts. And prompts are typically some textual pieces of information that we are typing into these type of systems. And then as an outcome, we are getting other types of data that is generated, and that data typically can be in a range of different formats, whether that's another text or image or video, programming code, and so on. So obviously, I'm sure many of you are now already well acquainted with many different types of technologies, from ChatGPT to Dolly to many other things that are already kind of on the market as well as in the research development. With respect to education, that's something that initially scared many in education because immediately some of our favorite assessment formats, call them essays, were partially or significantly jeopardized, and the extent to which education should be looking into the future, but there are many other things that were related to it. There was lots of media debate in that period, lots of commentaries, and many things happened. But in the meantime, also we've seen lots of documents that were produced by different types of governments or international organizations. Here, I'm just mentioning a couple of documents that I was quite engaged with. The Office of Educational Technology, which is under the US Department of Education. They produced a document on artificial intelligence and the future of teaching and learning. I was fortunate to participate in some of their early work as well and contribute to some of their listening sessions in connection between artificial intelligence and assessment. And it offers really a range of different insights and recommendations how AI can be leveraged for effective teaching and learning. Similarly, UNESCO produced a document, and I'm sure our government in Singapore produced something. Here in Australia, there is something. European Commission produced something. So there are many of these type of documents now out there. The question is where to go and what to start reading first. To me, these are two couple of really useful documents. But then you may wonder, okay, this is another talk about things that are out there, we heard. I really want to kind of emphasize three key points. The talk will be generally relatively broad, so I don't aim to go into very specific technical things. but I want to basically talk about certain types of promises that we've seen that generative AI can offer for education. I want to also raise a range of different concerns that are quite valid.
Hello, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I was, we have a AI
not muted.
little workshop, but I can step out.
All right, okay. So we put them on mute. So then the second thing I'm going to be talking about lots of concerns, because every technology always brings lots of concerns and no technology is perfect. And then the final thing is also that we need to really kind of deeply engage into different types of needs that we need to consider in the future when it comes down to education in the age of AI. Some people heard me. When I speak, I generally like to give takeaways right away. So if I basically start boring you in the middle of my talk or you have to run somewhere else, at least you got some of your key points. Point one is that there's lots of really promise that comes from artificial intelligence, generative AI, for guiding students, for helping teaching, support, and offering different types of things, and then also for feedback and assessment that is partially or fully automated. Key points too is that we can see significant concerns about reliability and bias of AI technologies. Also, there are issues related to workload that is really particularly concerning for some of us who are involved in the education business. And then the final thing is obviously with respect to the informed consent and how data are used as part of the process. Number three is that we really need to move away from just looking into the commentaries that are out there or half-baked studies to go to much more deeper research to understand implications for education, for human learning, and actual teaching. I'm going to now dive into the promise and what I want to kind of outline about that process. Last year, mid last year, we published a systematic mapping study that outlined different practical and ethical challenges of large language models in education. We identified a range of different applications that at the time were already available for the use of large language models in education. But in a nutshell, I want to basically emphasize one key feature and why some of these and many of these things are happening. They're addressing lots of different types of tasks that have been attempted to be addressed in one way or the other way in education through different types of technologies, in many cases for decades. The key point is of generative AI is that it can actually make some of these quite tricky tasks, like creating a chatbot that can be helpful in education, much faster. It can become faster, scalable, and also becomes really kind of something that can be done in a relatively rapid manner. I'm going to specifically talk about 4 key promises that I would like to highlight out of 9 that we were discussing in the systematic mapping study. Number 1 is that we see huge promise of large language models for guiding and tutoring students in different types of situations. Some of you probably came across Khanmigo, which is a chatbot developed by Khan Academy. Khan Academy is being a quite popular online platform for different STEM and other disciplines. It is primarily focused on K-12, but we've seen also uses in higher education as well. They primarily wanted to enhance the experience of the students as part of the process, and then the learners would then be able to converse with Khanmigo while they were also engaging in different types of resources. They primarily designed Khanmigo in such a way that it does not give the answers to the students, but instead is trying to guide them for the students to get to certain answers by themselves, how to best approach their learning and so on. And the nice thing about Khanmigo, and there's lots of information that can be found as well, primarily coming, for example, from Khan Academy's chief learning officer, they are basically saying how relatively simple way they use to implement some of the most effective rhetorical structures that can be used, and different types of dialogue acts that are documented in the literature almost 30 years ago, and how rapidly they were able to prototype this chatbot. Similarly, they provided similar types of scaffolds that can be used to promote creativity. We've seen also lots of other disciplines that are emerging. For example, in programming, we are seeing work. For example, this is the work that a colleague here in Australia spoke about, Hassan Khosravi, about helping write computer programs, help identify bugs inside of these programs, and also potentially explain the code. And this is just a simple example that was done in some of the versions of ChatGPT. But then much more recent work is done on creating a specialized environment that helps the learners to debug and then also explain to the students the code. This is a collaboration between Microsoft, the University of Michigan, and the Fraunhofer University in Europe, in Germany. And they basically then looked into different types of explanations and the efficacy of these type of things, that they were basically looking into the very detailed explanations in certain situations, or having simple one-sentence hits, and then also providing students even with certain level of validation whether code was valid or not. And then they basically already start generating empirical evidence about the efficacy of this type of assistant. The second point I want to emphasize is large language models for content generation and general teaching support. So in a way, those who are involved into teaching, they can get lots of different supports. I think the person around the world who is doing really lots of interesting work in terms of the leveraging and creating different types of prompting strategies that can help educators, different types of teaching personnel in higher education or even lower levels of education, is Anisha Bakaria at the University of Queensland. So this is one of her early works in which she was actually demonstrating how learning designers can get to write different types of prompts, to use ChatGPT to produce content for some of their lessons, or at least early drafts from the kind of learning outcomes to the ideas there, and also generate in a web-friendly format that can be easily deployed inside of different types of web platforms. In her more recent work, she's done a very thorough examination of different types of prompting strategies that can be used to generate a range of different interesting resources. This is much more relevant for K-12, I guess, education, but probably also for those who are involved in language education, in higher education. And that is, for example, to create crosswords, but she also kind of ranges and ideas that she's working on from different administrative tasks to many other types of tasks that we are actually dealing with. In this specific case is supporting teachers to create a crossword, and then that kind of a list of the things that was generated by generative AI can be used in specialized websites that can generate crossword puzzle, and then students can directly interact with that type of information. I've been also interacting a fair bit with different types of psychometricians who are involved in creating a large language, who are involved into these high-stake assessments here in Australia and beyond. They really enjoy large language models because it helps them generate different types of items or ideas how students can be assessed, and then they are using that as input into much more rigorous reliability and validity types of procedures that are commonly used when we are creating robust assessment instruments. We've seen also, again, with Khanmigo, another chatbot version of Khanmigo that is supporting primarily teachers and what kind of approaches they can take to teach their students, give them ideas, and they can converse in different types of strategies. At Stanford, they also developed a GPT-Teach, which is primarily intended to support teacher development by those who are in higher education. So instead of you dedicated an hour of your time today listening to me, at Stanford, they are thinking it's probably maybe a better idea for you to use GPT-Teach so that you can, for example, practice online office hours, or use even simulated way of doing the online classrooms through, say, Zoom, and how you can then engage into that kind of online office hours, or even a proper session where you are conversing all the time with different types of computer agents that are simulating different types of students. Obviously, in their case, they were talking about in the range of 800 students, primarily different types of teaching assistants or those who were involved into the early stages of their academic careers who are trying to develop their teaching skills. Number 3, we see also huge potential of large language models to be used to produce automated feedback. We did one of the early studies in this process. We published it almost like a year ago. And we basically looked the extent to which, if you are using ChatGPT or even the repeated experiments with GPT-4 and some other language models as well, the extent to which we can get readable feedback, how that feedback that is GPT generating is aligned with human instructors in terms of identifying positive or negative points about students' work, and also how that feedback is performing with respect to some of the really well-established practice in the literature on feedback. What we are seeing is that we are finding that GPT is generating far more readable feedback than instructors that we use to provide feedback on students' written products in higher education, mostly different types of project proposals, project reports, or essays. We also identified that there is relatively limited alignment between points that instructors are saying that should be kind of positive or negative. But in many cases, that doesn't mean that it's not completely reliable, but it means that it may actually point out to other things in students' work that instructors did not identify. So in a way, it gives us an idea that this type of technology can be helpful to complement some of our work when we are providing students with feedback, and we know how terribly we are in higher education time deprived to offer some of these type of useful information to the student. And then the final thing is that we are seeing, and especially with GPT-4, significant promise that not only is providing whether something is correct or not, but it's actually giving students really good prompts, what next they need to study, how they can approach their learning, and how they can improve and adopt different new types of strategies. We've also seen, and we are having specialized environments. I'm going to be speaking about that much more in a couple of weeks when I'm talking about assessment. But in our group, we are developing this environment that is supporting self-regulated learning, especially in different types of information problem-solving tasks where students need to find relevant information and then create a written product like an essay or a report, etc. Specifically, we are basically one of the things we are asking students to use different types of rhetorical structures. And that's really important because we want to, in some of these, for students to create really strong arguments inside of their essays. So we are actually then annotating these essays with respect to what kind of structures they're using. In this specific case, we use Bloom's taxonomy to then as a foundation to measure the extent to which students were integrating information from the source documents that we curated for them or tracked when they were using this environment that they interacted with. And then based on that, they are getting lots of feedback. We also have similar facilities. I'm going to be talking about that much more in a couple of weeks, as I mentioned, that are directly using GPT, chatbots, and so on. One other thing that is really quite interesting is that this type of feedback in generative AI is not only limited for digital environments only, but it's also holding a good potential to transform and to be used in physical learning environments. In our case, we are really doing lots of work on multimodal data about learning, and we are trying to generate something we call data comics. So let me just show you this very quick example. We are quite heavily involved at Monash in different health professions education. whether it's nursing education, medical doctor education, or even interprofession education. We are primarily focusing on simulation-based learning, and inside of these types of situations, we are basically collecting data from different sensors. We use positioning sensors, so we can see the indoor location of the students when they're engaged in the participation. We also record their voices. We also record the interactions that they had with the mannequins. And then we also even use different types of wristbands so we can get some of their biological sensors. So some of the things what we are then using when we are using generative AI and similar types of technologies. First one is obviously for speech recognition. We do in real time transcription. We use Whisper, which is produced by OpenAI. But then we also have large language models that are helping us to immediately do the tagging of the discourse that students have when they are engaging with different types of collaborative tasks as part of the process. That tagging is helping us to understand, for example, how that teamwork is operating, the extent to which it's effective or not. We also collect all these types of data, and then with the instructors, we co-designed different types of dashboards that are helpful for them. These dashboards they can configure to use in the debrief session. So some of them are based on the students' positioning data, some of them are based on the turns that students are taking when they are talking to each other. Some of them are based on just primarily teamwork. And then they configure what they are going to show their students in terms of the presentation and discuss that. However, what we are also seeing here as a really promising direction is combination of these technologies that are generating from text image. So we are using the input of all these analytics to then prompt mid-journey so that we can generate, we call these data comics, where different phases of these simulations can then be presented in a much more approachable way to the learners, and also without necessity for us to necessarily show them visual charts. And this is decreasing the need for the data literacy of these participants and potential for us to highlight some of these key points. Although this looks really cool and exciting, perhaps for some of these situations, we may avoid comic presented in this way because some of the students found them as much as useful, also a bit childish in a way how it's presented. But it really just gives us an idea how promising these technologies can be. I'm going to just very briefly touch on the assessment because this is really, really important. I'm going to just give you a teaser for the talk I'm going to have in a couple of weeks at the same time. 2 years ago, we published a paper just before the hype started, in which we outlined generally 5 different opportunities how AI can help us improve different types of AI practices. So often assessment is really very onerous. AI can make that assessment much more feasible. Often assessment happens in very discrete points in time, but we really have limited opportunities to have that assessment to be continuous. Something that probably many of you heard of as well is that assessment often is uniform, but we want to make it much more adaptive. And there's long tradition of adaptive testing systems in education and beyond. One thing that I'm going to highlight today is like how to make assessment much more authentic. Well, the example that I was just showing is very authentic type of situation in which students are getting involved, and then the extent to which we can then in these type of relatively authentic situations provide also assessment is really something very relevant. Finally, we are now at the verge to make some of these things much more modern when we are assessing. So what is the skill of writing? Is the skill of writing just writing without any technical means, or is the skill of writing with some of the technical means? I guess the answer is not straightforward. Depends what level of education and what kind of learning outcomes we want to achieve with that. But it's basically something that is prompted with some of these technologies. With respect to the authentic assessment, and this is just a very simple example, we've seen already in the literature that the idea is that we can generate really interesting simulated assessment environments. We've seen in the use of the generative AI technologies, for example, Meta's visual box, that we can get relatively convincing digital avatars, and they can be used. And we've seen also some of the work in terms of generating virtual standard patients who are basically that are underpinned by the large language models, and even using some bit more kind of robust technologies that are addressing some of the limitations of the large language models, so that they can then provide students with a relatively good simulated experience to see how they are using and interacting with patients, and also at the same time assessing them. We'll drill much deeper into these type of things, especially with the area within the lens of the area I'm mostly coming from, and that's learning analytics, in a couple of weeks. All right, so I'm now wrapping up the rosy land of generative AI in education. I'm trying to now enter a bit of a land of gloom and bloom. And in that space, I'm going to highlight a few key points. First one is that generative AI techniques are not flawless. One of the documents, and I think we are getting much broader support, was written a book a few years ago by Gary Marcus and Ernest Davis. They were at the time both from New York University. And what they basically emphasized is that generative AI technologies do not necessarily have strong reasoning or planning features. One key point for us to understand in that particular sense is that they don't have sense of truthfulness. They don't have temporal or spatial awareness. They don't really do huge amount of causal inference. They don't have common sense, and so on. So these are really important things. And that's why we often, when we are using these type of technologies, we often see that they are generating lots of different failures. And there was a document that was really interesting to follow up until mid last year, where they documented many different types of problems that generative AI are doing. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is, with all these promises that I was talking about, but we are inducing relatively simple generative AI technologies in them, we are also running a risk that some of these problems may emerge inside of these technologies. Number two, I want to really ask us to think a little bit about workload implications of artificial intelligence in education. Look, me as a computer scientist entered the study of AI because it was always really cool to think about different ideas, how we can increase productivity, address important problems for education, and so on. But then that's really always a cool aspirational thing. But one thing that I learned over the years is that productivity is not equal to reduced workload. So I always like to the example that was mentioned also in the opinion piece in the Atlantic last year, in which they used email. Probably many of you appreciate email in terms of the productivity to communicate with many people around the world. But for goodness me, email is completely destroying my workload. And the extent to which we will see similar types of implications with generative AI is really interesting to see and observe. We did the systematic lit review a few years ago now, in which we looked into the automatic feedback systems and the extent to which they can be useful for human learning. We found lots of benefits, improvement in learning outcomes, etc. But we found no study that reported the decrease in the workload of the teaching staff with the introduction of some of these technologies. Because the moment you introduce and address some of these tasks, you potentially open some other things that need to be done and tackled. There's another important thing that we are actually dealing with, and that's lots of ethical implications of generative AI in education. We basically see, and there was research as well published last year, in which they basically, when it comes down to certain privacy, but also agency issues of the students, that large language models can affect negatively students' experiences. And they were specifically in this study looking into the extent to which we want to fully give the decisions to large language models to make decisions about students' grades, etc. What they were basically suggesting in that paper is if you want to assure that level of trust and also relative fairness, that making these type of critical decisions should be deferred to the humans. The other important thing is, and even if they are provided with the AI technologies, they should be labeled and such with a sort of a warning message. So it's very clear who that point is coming from rather than to try to think about something else. There's another important thing that comes up more and more in education as an argument. I even have that, and I don't have a strong argument to answer to the students. We get that kind of in terms of the terms of the use, etc., that this type of content is not going to be used. But there's really no easy mechanism to track where and how data that are used inside of the large language models to prompt them or to train them, how they're going to be used in the future. That's something that is not necessarily offering students huge amount of control. And we also know that in many situations, if some of that information is picked up and used for training of a large language model, it's really difficult to unlearn that information. You cannot just say, oh, remove that now from my data set once you produce that language model. So it's not a problem that they'll always tell and repeat that information as it was used at the input, although we are seeing some interesting examples as well recently through the lawsuit against OpenAI by New York Times, that there are ways how that can be bypassed as well. Is the problem is we don't know when that can be done and used as such, and therefore some private data may actually emerge very easily, and we need to think about these type of protections. The other thing is also to think about is these training data sets that are used for large language models, who they are, which data they are based on. We've seen one of the largest resources used for training some of these models is Wikipedia. And we see that generally global West and mostly Western countries are predominantly those who are contributors. Predominantly English is also the largest part of Wikipedia. From the perspective of gender, we are also having some of the documents that are and studies that are actually demonstrating that it's dominated by men. So the other important thing is that we were also looking is in terms of some of the kind of equity of large language models research, we see that great majority of research is still in English, while all other languages are heavily underrepresented, especially when you account for the number of the speakers of some of these languages. So we really want to see the extent to which these large language models are used in education much more equitably over the course of time. Final thing is that these models, and we did research as well, published a couple of years ago in a major computational linguistics conference, they inherently carry a significant bias. This is just a simple prompt that we use for Midjourney. We want to generate patriotic dog who is superhero. And as you can see, a very masculine Americanized version of a dog that is actually clearly perpetuating some form of bias that is already embedded into the data set specifically. There are certain strategies how these biases can potentially be mitigated. For example, one of the key things is to immediately declare the culture or the country you are coming from, and then ask then GPT to address that and use that as part of the context. But for many, that potentially be a challenge. And it is actually nicely offering me a segue to the final part of my talk, and in which I want to talk about the needs. What are those specific needs that we need to pay attention to? And the first point is that kind of need that we need to develop and measure skills for the age of AI. So, for example, even that type of thing that I said, how to prompt properly a language model, is really one of these key skills that is important. This is important for many different levels. There was a report published sometime last year in which OpenAI, in collaboration with a couple of others, were basically looking at the labor market impact by the use of large language models. And they found that about 80% of the jobs descriptions that were listed in some of the largest registers of the jobs in the US, they would have at least about 20% of exposure to large language models. Exposure does not mean that they will be replaced by large language models, but instead may require the use of the technologies that are based on large language models. And some, about 20% of the jobs would have almost more than 50% of their tasks fully exposed to large language models. So that's really one of the key important things, is that we need to think about something which is often conceptualized as form of an AI literacy and even beyond. Why AI literacy is important? Well, probably some of you heard of this example of the lawyer last year who got in trouble trying to use GPT technologies to produce the entire court filings for their client. Obviously, GPT, how it is, just hallucinated, fabricated lots of different court cases, and then the other side, the prosecution, complained to the judge they could not find a single case that was cited in the filings of this lawyer. Eventually, the lawyer admitted they used ChatGPT fairly carelessly, and then they got fined for that act. They were fined primarily because they were AI illiterate and without knowing how and what are the limits, how to use a particular technology. So with respect to the kind of AI literacy, there are lots of different conceptualizations. I think there's now more than 20 different types of instruments how we can measure AI literacy that is published in the literature. One of the interesting examples of the conceptualization of AI literacy is produced a couple of years ago as well by the University of Hong Kong. And they were basically using Bloom's taxonomy, in which they were basically starting from just relatively basic knowledge to use particular information in new situations to produce original work, that is to say, to the level of creativity. We also published in 2022 a paper which was a polylogue in which we had a very interdisciplinary team of people looking from the different types of perspectives, what kind of competencies are directly related to AI. And we eventually settled around three key perspectives. Humanistic perspective that is looking into different types of human values and freedoms, human-centered AI, to the social perspective that is mostly looking into the AI-mediated dialogue, knowledge, artistry, network learning, etc., to the cognitive perspective, which was also looking into different types of metacognitive skills, thinking about hybrid cognition, and then thinking about different ways how we can reconceptualize creativity. We are also seeing lots more emphasis recently on really kind of redefining that and exploring the human-AI relationship. And this is already leading into the redefinition of some of the skills we aim to develop and potentially to assess also in higher education. Some of my favorite ones are basically to think about human-AI collaborative problem solving, where you have a group in which you have humans, but also some of the AI agents that are trying to participate in the problem solving. That has not been still addressed, to my knowledge, in the literature, but something really important to consider. The work that is already ongoing is led by Inge Molenaar in the Netherlands, in which she's defining hybrid human and AI regulation instead of just thinking about self-regulated learning or co-regulated learning, where we are as the competent other are supporting the learners, and then the extent to which AI is participating as part of that process. The final thing I want to discuss today in terms of these open challenges and the needs that we need to think about is real impact on learning of these type of technologies. I had this hypothesis more than a year ago, in which I said that fluency is not a bliss for learning, and that in many situations, because generative AI can produce very fluent, very articulate, very confident responses in many situations, that will lead into something which I call lazy metacognition. That means that people generally, when they see relatively fluent responses to certain situations, they have much harder task to detect discrepancies. And typically, we know from some of the conceptualization of metacognitive monitoring and judgment of learning, that type of a thing, if we are not easily to detect some of these discrepancies and the problems, is typically leading us in all sorts of biases, and we are actually much easier to accept certain information, even though it has lots of problems. Some evidence for this is emerging. This was a recent study as a preprint in which they looked at the extent to which people prefer the use of the responses of ChatGPT versus the use of the responses generated by humans in some of these question and answering platforms that are available for different types of problems. What I found is that in almost 52% of the cases, ChatGPT had inaccuracies in its responses. And according to some of the metrics they used, in 77% of the cases, responses were verbose. Yet about 40% of the participants still preferred ChatGPT because they preferred its meticulous style and they also liked its comprehensiveness. So in a way, this is already providing us with some of this evidence for this specific thing. The other important thing is many of us know who are in higher education that writing is a very important learning tool for reflection, for really just organizing some of our information or some of our knowledge. It's really helping us to do many types of things. So then the question becomes, especially long term, is what happens when much of that important learning tool function is offloaded into generative AI? In a way, when our learners become deprived from the opportunity to effectively use that very important learning tool. Then the other important thing for us to think about is as well as how well learners in many situations will be used to use generative AI technologies. Remember, generative AI technologies are dependent on writing good prompts. Literature in educational cognitive psychology tells us that learners are not necessarily great at asking good questions. So then the question becomes is, how can we expect that the learners will be able to make use of some of these technologies effectively if they don't know how to ask the good questions in the first place? There's lots of literature out there that was done on what kind of strategies we can use to improve that, but I think we need to go back to some of that literature and then also do much more research in the existing new context. And the final point I'm going to be making today is really much better methodological rigor. We need to have much better sound evidence for many claims, outrageous claims that are made out there in terms of how proficient or great some of these generative AI technologies. It was a really interesting debate mid-2023 when people made this kind of point, and some of them are faculty members. They had this preprint in which they made a claim that ChatGPT can really outperform final year students of MIT on different types of final exams in electrical engineering and computer science. Their smart students got not necessarily happy with that kind of claim, and then they replicated that entire study and found lots of unreliable methodological decisions that led into the claims that were not supported with the actual data. Thankfully, that kind of preprint study was also retracted. And it's really important to kind of see these type of examples and to think about the quality of the evidence that we need to require to make our decisions about learning and teaching and broader space of education. All right, this brings me to the end of my talk today. I want to basically just say that I hopefully made an argument today that we really need to broaden our understanding of human learning with, about, and despite generative AI technology. But the other important thing is, and I heard this story as well in many cases, spoke to many teachers in schools, but also faculty members in higher education. And some of them say, oh, this is just a hype and it's going to go away. It's very unlikely at this stage to go away. And the most important thing is that we need to think about how we can lead a change so that we can get the type of AI for education the way we would like it, rather than to have the type of AI that is done to us and our learners. If you are interested in continuing some of these debates and get really interesting resources and information, I suggest to also pay attention to BRAIL, which is the Research Alliance for AI in Learning and Education. Hosts a number of different sessions, different webinars, different activities, at the same time has a global fully online conference that is completely free for participation and also has a physical event as well. And on that very note, thanks so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any of the questions that you may have.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Hansel.
Yes, hi. So thank you, Professor Gasevic, for sharing with us the exciting opportunities with Gen AI, the concerns and the needs that we need to pay attention to. Actually, one of the things that you said about, the productivity, increased productivity doesn't really mean that there's reduced workload, right? So I'd like to thank you for really replying to our email and agreeing to come to this talk and adding to your workload. So I just have a few comments, and perhaps then I will open it up to the floor as well. So based on what you've actually described, what do you see is the role of a teacher or professor in the age of generative AI? And in that light, do you think that the key knowledge and skills that every teacher or professor would need in this new age to fulfill the role? I understand you have actually mentioned about AI literacy, but are there other skills that you see are also important that every professor and teacher would need to have? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. And I had a relatively similar question as well the other day here at Monash University. And somebody asked me, I generally build on what I already posited as well a few years ago about learning analytics. And this is basically now just going a bit deeper here as well, because generative AI is far more ubiquitous and it's kind of affecting far more things. I think it's going back to some of these things. It has to basically be kind of defined as an interplay with generative AI, but it's clearly generative AI that is connected with the learning design or educational design. You need to basically effectively know how and what kind of tasks are good to be integrated with the different types of generative AI. So in a way that kind of, you can call it also important pedagogical knowledge. But beyond that, you saw me as well speaking about these type of things. People need to know also in education to know a certain level of theoretical knowledge about human learning as well that is coming about from the evidence. It's not just the design. Need to understand certain level of metacognition, need to understand certain level of different types of functions that we are actually having in terms of cognitive, metacognitive, and so on, that are relevant. And obviously all that to be integrated with the disciplinary knowledge. Because I think one of the key things is that people often, at least in early days, I don't think anybody in this room today is doing that. But we need to also be effective at teaching our students that ChatGPT is not a search engine. And many of them, as we are going, will be confusing that. And in a way, they need to be equipped how to help the students to understand the danger as well, how you can be much easier exposed with the use of generative AI, because in almost every situation, there is that level of inaccuracy, hallucination, etc. And it's a fundamental architectural, you can call it bug or feature of the generative AI that cannot easily be fixed without some other fundamental challenges to be addressed. And so to me, that's really one of the key things, is how we are incorporating some of that kind of understanding that is going into the broader information or digital type of literacies that are now so tightly connected with the generative AI technologies.
We would like to invite any questions from the audience, or we invite you to turn on your mics and ask questions directly, or if you'd like to type your questions into the chat, please do so as well.
Yeah, while somebody is asking questions, I saw one question in the chat, whether the slides will be shared. I'm very happy to share it, so I'll share it with Young, and then he can do whatever he likes to do with the slides to get them with everybody who is in the room.
Okay, we do have a question coming through the chat from Sun Ding. I guess, are there any successful practical examples of institutes actually incorporating generative AI in the learning adoption landscape?
So that's a really, really good question. I cannot say that we've seen like a whole institution example how people are integrating generative AI in their cases. I think we've seen the first year, I call it completely reactive. And in that kind of reactive, in generally like a year ago, this time institutions were just scratching their heads and thinking, what can they do? And they generally have, different types of approaches. Some of them opted ban, but we all knew ban is impossible. Some others basically started to think about, okay, not ban, but just kind of predefine terms of use. And the final third thing was basically that people started actually thinking about how these institutions can create the specific types of tasks. At this very stage, we are seeing still relatively kind of individuals inside of the institutions are doing the use of generative AI that are, for example, common example could be that students are asked to critique the essays that were produced by generative AI. So students would be asked to prompt an essay, to prompt a chat GPT or large language models, and then it would be students would be used to critique that type of essay. To me, that's fine, except that one of the key things is often not mentioned, that we are not thinking anymore about the same learning outcomes. Because critiquing somebody else's work, even if it's that kind of essay, is different from the skill that you need to produce an essay and then assess it. So in a way, it's helpful in that situation to kind of promote what I call, and what is called in the literature as well, feedback literacy. So that's one of the kind of the things we've seen in the past, and I think that kind of equally applies to that type of situation. For example, Georgia Tech implemented quite extensively use of the chatbots that were not necessarily based in early days on the generative AI, but they were actually providing students with a triage of the questions that they would have in different types of fora that are online. And they had that kind of thing that was called Jill Watson, and she was voted usually the best and most popular teaching assistant in these type of online courses. And so I think we will be seeing more probably institutions opting for some of these type of things, but I'm yet to see an institution which made a kind of a considerable leap in terms of saying we are kind of fundamentally changing our curriculum and doing certain types of things in a much more systemic way.
Dragan, I'd like to follow up on your response. And I'm just wondering, and this also relates to one of your last slides where you said that we ought to lead the change. But I'd like to ask, in your opinion, how can institutions, faculty, and perhaps students find consensus on how to go about carrying out this change?
It's a really, really fundamental, big question that you are asking. I think one of the key things is that generative AI just basically showed some of the things that institutions are often in many situations, although there are the sources and the places where lots of the knowledge about generative AI is generated, when it comes down to the understanding of its own core functions, are reactive rather than being proactive, right? So that's one of the key things that is out there. So that's number one. Number two is also the key question is, if you know that there's this type of technology that can produce really effective essays, etc., and there's really low probability of the automatic detection of these type of problems, especially to have convincing evidence to do these type of technologies, then you need to kind of think about, okay, what else can we do, right? And so what are the issues and how to do these type of things? And that eventually lead us to some of the fundamental discussions we had always in educational technology adoption in terms of the leadership. What is the role of the leadership, right? And so that kind of leadership that is not just operational leadership, but the leadership that is entrepreneurial and leadership that is also enabling. Shane Dawson from University of South Australia is building on the complexity leadership theory and has really interesting models and developed the whole SPARK model together with Abelardo Pardo and George Siemens when it comes down to that. And I think that type of a model is really interesting to consider as well, particularly these type of things, because we need to navigate the complexity of the institutions, the daily politics that is driving lots of our decisions, and at the same time thinking about how we can guide and lead that change rather than to just be surprised, oh, this change happened to us.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Pavel in the chat. I'll just read it out. So his question is broadly, what impact do you think AI will have on the development of our communication skills? For example, you mentioned importance of writing for learning and thinking. Do you think that development of writing skills will now be more emphasized, or will our writing skills degrade?
It's a really, really terrific question. I wish I knew the answer to this fantastic question. And my kind of feeling is that I'm concerned that we'll see more degradation in the writing skills, but not necessarily because that's desirable, right? How can you eventually, and especially that kind of deterioration of the writing skills started at the earlier age, we don't know what are the ramifications of that deterioration of that particular skill in the kind of long term. What are the ramifications of that when these kids come to universities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the things is that we need to really kind of still think about situations where that skill is really important and emphasize it, and think about the ways and the models, how they are actually supposed to be improving and developing these skills. I'm going to be speaking about that flora environment in particular when I'm speaking in 2 weeks, how we are actually thinking that we actually focus that kind of assessment on the writing, not necessarily in the search of the information, not necessarily on the final product, and that kind of ignore the black box of the process, but through the leveraging of the learning analytics and other types of means that we have, that we can then provide much more process type of a feedback and even process type of assessment so that learners are improving their processes, how they're engaging. And as part of that process, they can leverage some of the generative AI, but it can also get lots of pushback from the teacher, from the technology and themselves, and how we are engaging as part of that process. So I think that opens up interesting opportunities, but we really need to think about these type of tasks and study much more, because we don't, at this very stage, don't have any robust empirical or scientific evidence to corroborate decision one way or the other way.
So, Jerry, if you don't mind, let me just add on to his advertisement, because actually when I think Tingson was actually asking about the question on whether there's institutional impact, the evidence of institutional impact on generative AI. Actually, I thought that what you are trying to do with the Flora project is perhaps it could be one example, perhaps not at the institutional level, but what, you know, a grounded approach in terms of like what faculty or groups of faculty actually come together to actually drive. Because then, and I really like your point about we being driven by the learning outcomes. What are we really trying to achieve? And thinking about how we can use generative AI to actually accomplish those learning outcomes. So it'll be great if the people who are actually in this talk will come for the next one. At the same time, let me just also advertise that when I think when Gasevic was actually showing or Dragan was actually showing the triangle chart about the levels of different literacy, I'd like to acknowledge that we actually have a group of faculty here at NTU that's really looking at the highest level of the AI literacy, which is actually to develop their own applications. In fact, we have a committee of practice on that. So for those of the people who are here, you are interested to actually join the particular committee, please just get in contact with me. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So maybe I leave time back to JY.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that we have a couple more questions coming through the chat, but just bearing in mind that it's 2 minutes past 1 o'clock, so just like to take this opportunity to end today's session, and we'll hang around a little to answer any more questions. But thank you everyone for being here at our webinar. Just like to inform or remind everyone that Dragan will be having a subsequent session, which he shared that you'll be focused more on assessments, and this will be in 2 weeks' time on the 31st of January. It will be the same time from 12 to 1. So we hope to see all of you at the next session. And thank you all for sharing your lunchtime here or spending your lunchtime here with us. We hope you have a great afternoon and week ahead. And yes, we'll be around here to answer or maybe talk about any further questions you may have about what Dragan has shared. So thank you very much. I'll just get to the next comment or so that Hanno has shared. So he's talking about, I think his question is, in light of AI and integrating AI into the course design, do we have to relook or move away from classic or existing learning management systems? And bearing in mind the learning comics suggests the use of visual learning platforms that address meta connection.
Yeah, that's really good question. Look, I agree. I mean, look, LMSs are almost at this stage becoming a burden in many situations. And Monash, they now implement in such a way that every course, everything has to have an identical structure everywhere. So it becomes almost like a enterprise model, and it's easy to scale, but then it does not addresses the nuances of the individual needs. So absolutely, I think we need to kind of think about these type of things. The key challenge always for institutions is how they are managing that kind of distribution of different types of technologies that could be done and used. And that kind of reminds me almost like to the first decade of this century, in which we discussed lots about personal learning environments, the ways how we can integrate data from different types of environments, and then help build that kind of broader picture. To me, that's probably the future that we are actually thinking. And I'm going to be also talking much more when we are talking about learning analytics and where we are kind of seeing some of this type of work, where we are actually creating the analytics at the level of the browser, and students can control, but learners are actually engaging into many different types of environments as they are kind of going as part of the process, and you are still able as a teacher to help them in a kind of very distributed learning environment. So that requires lots of bravery from the kind of the end of the institutions, because all of a sudden you are in a space that you are not controlling. But we are already in a space which we are not fully controlling.
We have another question from Min Chen, I believe. So question is, as individual teachers, the most immediate issue we have encountered is likely students' use of AI, generate presentation, content, or papers. So have you also faced this challenge, and how do you deal with it?
I think many, and we will find lots of reports of that. I think that's a kind of a common question. I think some, as I mentioned, are incorporating the use of generative AI in such a way that they ask students to use specifically to prompt generative AI to produce an essay or a paper. And then their task is then to critique what was generated there. So that's one of the things that is really important. The other important thing that, and some I've seen, but these are becoming more kind of the questions of the scale and how we are actually dealing with that, is the extent to which we can actually ask students to also then annotate their own essays. So in a way, as they are producing their paper or essay, they're also kind of producing a reflection of their own thing. And then also engaging into the peer review process. So that's one of the kind of the things, some of the few things. Some are returning to the old tools, like having like a oral presentation of their work or defending that. That's fine. I educated in a European system in which the entire education was fundamentally based on that. However, it's not quite scalable approach, and it's basically much more resource intensive. So the extent to which we can actually think about what is that relevant skill that we want from the student to generate in a particular situation. I think it's quite actually, we should be quite open as well to see how students are effectively using some of these AI technologies as part of the process. For example, I encourage students to use BART in particular to do proofreading of their pieces of work. I'm not teaching language. I'm teaching learning analytics and computer science. So for me, it's quite acceptable to do that. Obviously, it's much harder for those who are teaching English or teaching any other language, how they are dealing with these type of things. But it's some of these places where we kind of need to start from, and those are the common themes and common approaches that we've seen so far. And the third final thing that I'm keep repeating, that is that we are also developing new types of learning environments and with the learning analytics in which we are actually capturing the processes, how students are writing, when they are using generative AI, etc., not to police their work, but to actually provide them with a feedback how that is done, and also to then use that potentially as the part of the assessment of their entire writing and reading process, rather than just to assessing the final artifact. So I know that this is relatively broad answer that I provided, but hopefully is addressing the question satisfactory to many.
Okay. Anyone would like to invite to ask questions? Any further burning questions also for Dragan?
I guess there's another session, and I noticed that the questions has geared towards assessment as well. So maybe we can do it in the next session.
Yes, certainly. So if there are none, then we will end today's webinar session. Thank you very much, Professor Gasevic, for your time with us today. And we look forward to meeting you again at the next session.
Thanks so much. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.